Hello there, dear friend. Welcome to our world. Tonight, we're going to take a little trip into one of the most fascinating, but also the darkest parts of the medieval world. Picture a world where grand castles, valiant knights, and bustling markets are no longer the focus. Instead, let's turn our gaze to a figure that's often hidden in shadow, a necessary evil, yet deeply reviled, the executioner. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to experience the harsh realities of that time firsthand? I know it's a tough call, but I'm wondering whether you'd prefer to be the hand that swung the axe, tightened the noose, or wielded the torturer's tools. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the real, sometimes sad, story of what it's like to live on the edge of society. We'll do our best to understand. I'm sure you'll agree that being an executioner in the Middle Ages must have been really tough. I'm sure you're dying to know what else is hidden beneath the surface of this grim profession, aren't you? We want to take you on a journey. It's not just about learning, but about being immersed in a world you might have forgotten. So find a comfy spot, let your mind drift, and let the echoes of history surround you before we begin our journey into this challenging narrative. If you find yourself drawn to these immersive stories, to the untold tales of history, please take a moment to press that like button. It's so great to see our channel growing and reaching more and more curious minds like yours. And if you fancy going on more adventures like this, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any of the fascinating history. Most of all, I'd absolutely love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it as you join us on this journey? Your comments, your presence, and your feedback mean the world to me. And I'm so happy to know we're sharing these moments across time and space. Now, let's all together switch off the bright lights, put the phones on silent, and get ready to step into the world of the medieval executioner. It's a world that's both chilling and deeply human. The pre-dawn chill was a pervasive, biting presence, seeping through the rough-hewn walls of the small, solitary cottage. It was a cold that knew no season, a constant companion in this place set apart from the rest of the village. The air within was thick with the lingering scent of stale wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, a subtle, metallic tang that clung to the very fabric of the dwelling, a testament to the grim nature of its occupant's profession. For Marius, the man who served as the village's official executioner, each awakening was not a gentle transition from slumber to daylight, but a slow, heavy climb from the depths of a restless, dream-haunted sleep into the stark, unforgiving reality of his unique existence. He lay on his straw pallet, the rough wool blanket offering meager warmth against the pervasive cold. His eyes, though still closed, felt the subtle shift in the darkness, the faint, almost imperceptible softening that heralded the approach of dawn. His body, hardened by years of strenuous labor and the emotional weight of his duties, protested, the awakening with a chorus of quiet aches, a dull throb in his shoulders, a stiffness in his fingers, marks of a life spent grappling with the raw, brutal demands of his office. He was a man of impressive build, his frame solid and unyielding, etched with the scars of a life lived on the periphery of both law and humanity. The cottage itself was a reflection of his existence, isolated, functional, and devoid of the small comforts that graced even the humblest of peasant homes within the village proper. It stood a good distance from the last cluster of thatched roofs, separated by a stretch of untended, thorny scrubland and a narrow, winding path that few dared to tread. No joyful laughter spilled from its single small window. No sounds of communal life reached its mud and wattle walls. It was a silent sentinel, a grim landmark that the villagers pointed to with averted gazes and hushed whispers. Its very presence served as a constant reminder of the village's darkest necessities, and of the man who fulfilled them. As Marius finally pushed himself upright, a low groan escaping his lips, the quiet sounds of the house accompanied him. The faint rustle of the straw beneath him, the creak of the wooden beam above, the subtle whisper of the wind finding its way through unseen cracks. His movements were deliberate, economical. There was no haste, no joyful anticipation of the day, only the methodical preparation for another cycle of duty. His wife, Ilara, was already stirring by the cold hearth. Her movements were as silent and practiced as his own, a ghost of a presence in the dim light. She did not speak, nor did he. Words were a rare commodity in this home, often unnecessary, sometimes too heavy to bear. Their communication existed in the shared glances, the unspoken understanding born of years spent together in the shadow of his profession. Her face, etched with a quiet weariness that mirrored his own, held a subtle beauty that time and hardship had failed to entirely erase. She was a woman of immense strength, her resilience forged in the same crucible of isolation and stigma that defined his life. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, still lay huddled on their pallets, small, bundled forms lost in the oblivion of sleep. Marius's gaze lingered on them for a moment, a rare flicker of tenderness softening the usual grim lines of his face. They were his world, his reason for enduring the pervasive loneliness and the burden of his role. Yet even they lived under the long shadow of his work. Their playmates were few, their interactions with other village children almost non-existent. They were the executioner's children, and that label clung to them like an invisible shroud, defining their social standing before they even uttered a word. Ilara knelt by the hearth, carefully coaxing life back into the dying embers. A few small twigs, then larger pieces of salvaged wood, were placed with precision. Soon, a faint plume of smoke began to curl upwards, followed by a tentative flicker of flame, then a comforting glow. The warmth, slow to spread, was a welcome reprieve from the morning chill. Its subtle scent of burning wood mixed with the ever-present faint metallic tang in the air, a constant olfactory reminder of their grim reality. The morning meal was a meager affair, much like any other in a medieval peasant household, yet consumed with an added layer of quiet. A thin gruel, perhaps a piece of hard, stale bread, if they were fortunate, eaten in silence, the scraping of wooden spoons against earthen bowls the only sound. Marius observed his children as they ate, their faces still soft with sleep, there, small bodies already hardened by the constant demands of their existence. He wondered what dreams haunted their nights, what thoughts filled their waking hours, knowing that their childhood, like his own, would be shaped by the shadow of his role. After the hurried meal, the children would be given their first chores of the day. For the boys, it might be fetching water from the isolated well, or gathering firewood from the sparse woods nearby, tasks that kept them mostly away from the village proper. For the girl, it would be assisting Ilara with the endless domestic duties, spinning wool, mending clothes, or preparing what little food they had. These tasks, while common to all peasant children, were performed with an added weight of isolation. There were no neighboring children to share a laugh with, no casual encounters on the path. Their world was the cottage, and its immediate silent surroundings. Marius, too, would begin his specific solitary duties. In his profession, there were tasks beyond the public spectacle of execution, tasks that further cemented his outcast status. These were the other duties, the grim necessities that no one else in the village, no matter how desperate, would touch. One such task, common in the quiet months between public judgments, was the disposal of dead animals. Not merely the families, livestock, but often the carcasses of any beast that perished within the village limits, or even along the nearby roads. A cow struck by lightning, a horse that broke its leg, a pig succumbed to disease. These creatures, once vital, now represented a source of contagion, a festering problem. The villagers would leave them on the outskirts, near the path leading to Marius's cottage, a silent summons. He would collect his heavy iron hooks and a rough wooden cart. The smell was often overwhelming, even in the cold air. The flies, in warmer months, would swarm like a black cloud. His hands, gloved in thick leather, would expertly maneuver the hooks, grappling with the bloated, stiff bodies. There was no sentimentality, only efficiency. Each carcass had to be dragged to the designated dead ground, far beyond the village, often a secluded, forgotten hollow where the earth seemed to consume all that was put into it. The labor was backbreaking. The stench clung to his clothes and skin for days, no matter how much he washed. It was a constant physical reminder of the uncleanliness of his profession, a duty few acknowledged, but all depended upon. Another grim task, especially prevalent during outbreaks of plague or other virulent diseases, was the handling of their dead. When a villager succumbed to the great sickness or other swift, merciless ailments, the fear was so profound that even family members would often abandon the bodies. It was Marius who would be summoned, his presence a grim harbinger of finality. Wrapped in a simple, rough shroud, he would carry the cooling corpse from the silent home, his movements somber but efficient. There would be no mourners, no accompanying procession, just the lonely walk to the communal burial ground, often a hastily dug pit on the common land. The earth would receive its due, and Marius would return, the silence of the village following him like a shroud of its own. These were the silent, unseen pillars of his life, duties he performed when the gallows stood empty. They underscored his role as the societal cleanser, the one who dealt with all that was repugnant, all that others recoiled from. He was the barrier between the clean and the unclean, the living and the dead, the orderly and the chaotic. And for this, he was both utterly indispensable and utterly reviled dot as the sun finally broke through the perpetual gray, casting pale. Watery light through the small window, Marius would be well into his first task of the day, whatever grim necessity it might be. His isolation was not just physical. It was a profound, pervasive silence that seeped into his very soul. He spoke. Little, felt little, showed little emotion. A necessary defense mechanism against the weight of his existence. Yet, beneath the hardened exterior, beneath the layers of stoicism and practiced detachment, lay the quiet, unspoken story of a man bound by his role. A man whose life was a constant, dramatic testament to the dark necessities of the medieval world. And as he toiled in solitude, the village went about its bustling day, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the grim guardian who kept its unseen terrors at bay. The thin, watery light of dawn had barely begun to penetrate the small, grime-streaked window of Marius's cottage when he began the day's most significant ritual. It was a ritual performed not with reverence, but with a cold, almost surgical precision, a methodical dance with the instruments of his grim profession. These were not merely tools. They were extensions of his will, silent partners in the somber ballet of medieval justice. His workshop, if one could call it that, was a small, windowless lean-to attached to the side of his isolated dwelling. It smelled of iron, old wood, and the faint, unsettling tang that seemed to follow him everywhere. Here, hanging neatly on wooden pegs or laid out on a scarred workbench, resided the implements of his trade, The heavy axes, their blades dark and polished to a chilling sharpness. The coiled ropes, thick and unyielding. The various mallets and wedges. And the smaller, more intricate instruments used for less merciful forms of persuasion, their shapes unsettling even in the dim light. He approached them without ceremony. His hands, large and calloused, moved with unpracticed ease, a silent choreography born of countless repetitions. First, the axes. There were several, of varying weights and sizes, each chosen for a specific task. He took the heaviest one, its polished wooden haft worn smooth by generations of use, its massive head cool against his palm. He lifted it, testing its balance, feeling the familiar weight that settled deep into his shoulders. The process of sharpening was meticulous, almost meditative. He placed the blade against a coarse whetstone, then a finer one, the rhythmic scrape and grind of steel against stone, filling the silence of the workshop. Sparks, like fleeting, miniature stars, flew from the edge as he worked, illuminating the grim lines of his face. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, on the blade, seeking the perfect angle, the keenest edge. This was not about cruelty. It was about efficiency, about minimizing pain, about ensuring that the inevitable was swift and absolute. A dull blade meant prolonged suffering, and even Marius, bound by his brutal duties, understood the grim etiquette of his profession. As he worked, his mind, often a desolate landscape, would sometimes drift, not to the faces of the condemned, but to the origins of this gruesome legacy. He had not chosen this path. It had chosen him through the unforgiving lineage of his family. His father, a man of few words and haunted eyes, had initiated him into the trade when Marius was barely more than a boy. He remembered the first time he had been allowed into this very workshop, the sheer, bewildering array of tools, the strange smell that permeated everything. His father, a silent giant, had taught him the mechanics of each instrument, the physics of force, the anatomy of the human body, not as a healer would, but as one who knew how to dismantle it. The training was grim, rigorous. He had practiced. Uncondemned animals first, the squealing of a pig or the terrified bleating of a goat filling the air as he learned to strike with precision. Then came the demonstrations on effigies, then on fresh carcasses, learning how muscle and bone yielded to steel. His father had taught him to suppress emotion, to detach, to view the condemned as merely a task, a problem to be solved with the utmost efficiency. "They are already dead, Marius," his father's gruff voice echoed in his memory. "Their spirit has departed. You are but the hand of the law, severing the last thread." The first execution he witnessed had been a blur of fear and nausea, the acrid smell of blood, the roar of the crowd, the chilling finality of the blade. The first time he had performed one himself, his hands had trembled, despite weeks of practice, despite his father's watchful, unblinking gaze. He remembered the feeling of the axe biting into wood, the surprising resistance, the sickening thud, the sweat that had poured from him, the bile that had risen in his throat. His father had simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the grim. Passage. There was no praise, no comfort, only the unspoken understanding that the torch had been passed, the burden accepted. He moved on to the ropes. The hangman's knot, a deceptively simple loop, was perfected with methodical practice. He ran his calloused fingers over the thick fibers, feeling for any fraying, any weakness. The rope had to be strong, smooth, designed to tighten with terrible efficiency. He tested the knot repeatedly, pulling it taut, ensuring it would hold, that it would snap shut with merciless finality. Each twist, each tuck of the rope was a silent confirmation of his grim purpose. a stark reminder of the lives that would end at its cold embrace. There were other tools, too, for tasks far grimmer than the swift justice of the axe or rope. Branding irons, kept carefully polished, their tips ready to glow red-hot in the forge. The various tongs and pincers, the racks and wedges used for interrogation, for extracting confessions in the cold, echoing chambers of the local lord's keep. Marius seldom spoke of these, even to Alara. They were the tools of deeper suffering, of prolonging agony, and they left a different kind of mark, not just on the victim, but on the wielder. He handled them with a particular detachment, a careful avoidance of any thought about the pain they inflicted. They were, in a way, even more chilling than the executioner's axe, for their purpose was not swift death, but the deliberate, methodical breaking of the human spirit. He meticulously cleaned each piece, wiping away any dust, any lingering residue from previous uses. The act was almost therapeutic, a way of imposing order on the chaos of his profession. Each tool had its place, its specific function, its own grim history. He understood them intimately, perhaps better than he understood most living beings. They were his silent confidants, the only constant companions in a life defined by isolation. The sun had now fully risen, casting long, pale shadows through the cracks in the workshop walls. Its light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the faint sheen on the sharpened steel, the rough texture of the ropes. Marius stood amidst his instruments, a solitary figure surrounded by the implements of death. There was no pride in his work, no sense of power, only a quiet, profound weariness that settled deep into his bones. He was a cog in the brutal machinery of medieval justice, a necessary evil, bound by a lineage he had not chosen, performing duties no one else dared to touch. As he finished the last inspection, his gaze fell upon a small, crudely carved wooden bird, tucked away on a high shelf. It was a relic from his own childhood, a piece he had carved with immense care, a desperate attempt to create something beautiful, something full of life in this very workshop. It was a stark, poignant contrast to the gleaming steel and unyielding rope that now filled his working space. He reached out, his calloused finger tracing the smooth curve of the bird's wing, a rare moment of tenderness in his hardened existence. The small wooden bird was a silent testament to a childhood lost, a humanity buried deep beneath layers of grim necessity. He lowered his hand, the moment of reflection passing as quickly as it had come. Duty called. The tools were ready. He was ready. He had no choice but to be. He extinguished the small lamp that had provided extra light, plunging the workshop back into its accustomed dimness. The cold steel, the rough rope, the polished wood, they waited, silent and patient, for the next summons, for the next life to be rendered by the hands of the man who wielded them, a man forever bound to their cold poetry. The summons did not come with a rider on horseback, nor with a formal scroll presented by a lord's messenger. It arrived in the only way it ever did for Marius, in the silence. A small, crude wooden cart, pulled by a lone, gaunt donkey, would appear on the winding path leading to his cottage. It would stop at the very edge of his property, just beyond the thorny scrubland that served as an invisible barrier. The cart would be empty, awaiting its grim cargo. And usually, a lone, silent figure, a low-ranking guard from the Lord's keep, or a trusted village elder, would stand by it, their back turned, their gaze fixed on the distant village, never on Marius or his home. Their presence was the summons. Unmistakable and absolute. Today was no different. Marius, sharpening a small knife in his workshop, felt the shift in the air before he saw the cart. A subtle change in the direction of the wind, perhaps, or an almost imperceptible, quieting of the distant village sounds. He stepped out, his large frame filling the doorway, and saw the cart, the donkey patiently waiting, and the hunched figure of the elder, his back to Marius, his shoulders tense. No words were exchanged. There was no need. The message was clear. A dull, familiar throb began behind Marius's eyes. It wasn't fear, nor anger, but a profound, weary resignation. Another life, another spectacle, another stain on his soul. He walked back inside, the chill clinging to his clothes, a fresh layer on top of the pervasive cold he already carried. Elara, her face pale but stoic, met his gaze. She knew. She always knew. The children, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden, deeper silence of their parents, huddled closer together, their small eyes wide with unspoken questions. Their world, isolated as it was still acutely attuned to the rhythms of their father's grim duties. Marius moved with a methodical purpose, his thoughts already turning to the logistics of the day. He pulled on his heavy leather tunic, reinforced and darkened by years of blood and grime. He buckled the wide belt that held his various smaller tools, the strong, sharp knife for severing, the small pouch of sand for grip, the rough cloths for wiping away the inevitable. He carefully chose the specific axe from his workshop, its edge gleaming with the sharpness he had just honed. He did not look at the wooden bird on the shelf, nor did he allow his mind to linger on the simple warmth of his family. Professional. Detachment was a shield he had perfected over long, brutal years, a necessary barrier between the man and the instrument dot. As he stepped out of the workshop, the chosen tools in hand, the elder still stood by the cart, unmoving, his back still. Turned. Marius loaded the tools into the cart, the clatter of metal against wood echoing in the morning stillness. He took the donkey's reins, his large hand firm on the worn leather. He didn't look at the elder, nor did the elder turn. It was a silent agreement, an unacknowledged acknowledgement of the unspeakable nature of their transaction. The fewer words, the fewer direct gazes, the better for everyone involved. The journey to the village square was a familiar one, yet always filled with a unique tension. The path, usually deserted, now held a strange magnetism. As they approached the outskirts of the village, the first signs of the gathering crowd became apparent. Figures emerged from huts, moving towards the square like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They did not approach the cart directly. Instead, they veered away, creating a wide, almost palpable circle of emptiness around Marius and his grim procession. The silence that accompanied his passage was profound, heavier than any other sound. It was not a respectful silence, but a terrified, disgusted quiet. Eyes averted yet keenly aware followed his every movement from behind curtains, through cracked doorways, or from the safety of a distant field. Children, quickly pulled back into homes by their parents, sometimes, risked a quick, furtive glance, their small faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. You could feel their stares, like physical pinpricks on your skin, 1,000 unseen judgments. This was the true badge of his office, not the axe, but the invisible wall of revulsion that moved with him. The scents changed too as he entered. The village, the comforting smell of wood smoke and farm animals, gave way to the sharp, acrid scent of nervous sweat, the tang of unwashed bodies, the sickly sweet odor of cheap ale from the taverns already open. The murmur of the growing crowd was a low, restless hum, like a disturbed hive of bees, broken by the occasional harsh cough or the cry of a vendor. But as Marius passed, the murmurs would drop, a ripple of strained silence following him. He kept, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw tight, his shoulders set. He had learned long ago that meeting their eyes was a mistake. A direct gaze from the executioner was seen as an ill omen, a curse, a direct confrontation with the dark forces he embodied. He was not a man. He was a function, a necessary horror, and he had to maintain that terrifying detachment. To acknowledge their fear was to acknowledge his own humanity, and that was a weakness he could not afford in this role. The village square, usually a vibrant hub of market activity and daily life, was transformed. The market stalls were pushed back, leaving a vast, open space in the center. Here, the gallows stood, stark and menacing against the morning sky. A rough-hewn wooden frame, perpetually stained dark, its thick rope swaying slightly in the breeze. Or perhaps it was a simple wooden block, low and broad, placed directly on the muddy ground, awaiting the precise strike of his blade. The scaffold, temporary or permanent, dominated the scene, drawing all eyes, all fear. Around this grim stage, the crowd swelled, a restless sea of humanity. Farmers in their coarse tunics, their wives in simple dresses, merchants, even a few curious townspeople, all drawn by the morbid fascination of public justice. They stood at a respectful, fearful distance, a wide semicircle around the gallows, their faces a mixture of solemnity, morbid excitement, and relief that it was not them. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on all present. Marius led the donkey and cart directly to the base of the gallows. He unloaded his tools, arranging them on a small, worn piece of leather, his feet with the same meticulous care he had shown in his workshop. The axe, the knife, the rope, laid out, ready. He took a moment to inspect the gallows itself, testing the rope, checking the stability of the platform, his actions purely professional, devoid of emotion. He was simply ensuring the mechanism of justice would function flawlessly. As he performed these final preparations, he could feel the hundreds of eyes on him, a heavy, invisible weight. He was the focus of all their fear, all their revulsion, all their morbid curiosity. He was the embodiment of their collective guilt and their collective desire for order. And in that moment, standing beneath the unforgiving sky, surrounded by the silent judgment of the crowd, Marius knew with a chilling certainty that this was the true, inescapable badge of his office, the burden of being the one who stood alone, utterly indispensable, yet utterly despised, the chosen instrument of a justice that demanded a human price beyond the condemned. The stage was set, the audience waited, and Marius, the grim protagonist of this ancient ritual, was ready to play his part. The air in the village square was thick, heavy with the collective breath of hundreds. It wasn't merely the chill of the morning, but a cold born of apprehension, a silence woven from 1,000 held breaths. Marius stood by the gallows, a solitary pillar of grim duty, the polished steel of his axe reflecting the pale, indifferent sunlight. The crowd, a vast, restless sea of faces, pressed in a wide semicircle, their gazes fixed on the crude wooden structure and the figures gathered beneath it. Yet their eyes seldom lingered on Marius himself. He was merely an extension of the gallows, a part of the terrifying apparatus of justice. A low murmur rippled through the gathered throng as the condemned man was led forth. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. 2 guards, their faces impassive, gripped his arms, their armored presence a stark contrast to the condemned's fragility. The sound of their heavy boots on the muddy ground, the clink of the condemned's chains, each metallic clang echoed unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the square. This was the moment everyone had come to witness, the grim culmination of a crime and its judgment. Marius watched, his face a mask of practiced detachment. He noted the man's gait, the subtle tremors in his limbs, the way his head drooped, then jerked defiantly upwards. This was not a person to him, not in this moment. This was the next task, a problem to be solved with efficiency and precision. He had long ago learned to create an impenetrable barrier between the man, Marius, who sought the warmth of his hearth and the quiet presence of his family, and the executioner, a cold instrument of the law. To do otherwise was to invite madness. Local magistrate, a man of plump figure and a voice accustomed to command, began the final pronouncement. His words, though delivered in a booming voice, seemed strangely muted in the oppressive atmosphere. He spoke of the crime, of the laws broken, of the justice demanded by God and by man. His voice echoed off the timber-bird buildings surrounding the square, each syllable a hammer blow against the silence. The crowd listened, their heads bowed, their faces grim, perhaps imagining the horrors of the crime, perhaps simply absorbing the terrible finality of the words dot as the magistrate's voice reached its crescendo. Marius took a single deliberate step forward. The subtle shift in his posture was enough. A collective gasp, barely audible, swept through the crowd. All eyes, which had been fixed on the condemned or the magistrate, now flickered towards him and quickly away. He was the point of no return, the physical manifestation of judgment. His movements were fluid, precise. He positioned himself, calculating the precise angle, the necessary distance. He gripped the axe, its weight familiar in his hands. It was an extension of his arm, his will. He did not look at the condemned man, whose eyes were now fixed on some distant, unseen point beyond the gallows. He focused only on the block, the rough-hewn wood that would soon receive the final blow. The only sound now was the wind, a thin, mournful whistle through the gallows timbers, and the nervous shuffling of the crowd. The air crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Every eye was fixed, every breath held. The world seemed to shrink to this one grim point, this raw, visceral moment of finality. Then, the magistrate gave the final, clipped command. Proceed. Marius did not hesitate. His movements were a blur of cold efficiency. The axe swung upwards, a glint of polished steel catching the pale sunlight. There was no theatrical flourish, no unnecessary delay. Only the swift, brutal arc of the blade. The crowd, as one, seemed to tense, 1,000 muscles clenching in sympathetic anticipation. The sound was not what one might expect from the stories. Not a roar, not a shriek. It was a terrible, sickening thud. A wet, heavy sound that seemed to absorb all other noise, then dissipate into the stunned silence. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd again, louder this time, followed by a low, almost visceral groan, a sound of release and horror. It was done. The mechanism of justice, through Marius's hand, had played its final, terrible note. Air, thick with the lingering tension, slowly began to thin. A few people in the crowd, overcome, would turn away, perhaps vomit into the mud. Others would simply stand, frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the indelible image. Children who had managed to sneak a peek despite their parents. Efforts might whimper, their innocence irrevocably tainted. Marius ignored them all. His gaze remained fixed on the result of his work, ensuring its completion. His movements were methodical now, the task shifting from execution to disposal. The body, once a living vessel, was now a mere object. The guards, who had been stiff with apprehension, now moved with a renewed, if grim, purpose, assisting him in the removal. The process was swift, undignified. The gallows, once the focal point of all attention, quickly became just a wooden structure again, its grim purpose fulfilled. The ground beneath it, soaked and stained, would soon be covered with sand or dirt, an attempt to erase the evidence. Though the memory would linger for generations, Marius remained impassive throughout. He wiped the axe blade with a rough cloth, then carefully sheathed it. His hands, though they had just ended a life, were steady, his breath even. The detachment was complete. He had performed his function, a crucial, if detestable, part of the social order. He was the sharp edge of the law, the enforcer of boundaries, and his efficiency was, in its own grim way, a form of public service. As the last remnants of the grisly scene were cleared, the crowd, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, began to disperse. They did not linger. The morbid fascination had given way to a chilling realization of mortality. They sought the comfort of their homes, the familiarity of their daily lives, eager to shake off the unsettling presence of the executioner and the terrible deed he had performed. They would speak of it in hushed tones for days, perhaps for weeks, but they would do so behind closed doors, away from the grim square. Marius stood for a moment, the silence of the now emptying square settling around him once more. The air, though still carrying the scent of human fear and residual decay, felt lighter. The direct, hundredfold gazes were gone, replaced by averted eyes and quickly retreating figures. He was alone again, as he always was after such an event. The feeling was a familiar one, a deep, profound isolation, a silent understanding that he was essential, yet eternally separate. He collected his tools, placing them carefully back into the wooden cart. He took the donkey's reins and began the slow, solitary journey back to his isolated cottage. He did not look back at the gallows, nor at the few lingering, wide-eyed onlookers who still dared to watch him go. His path was fixed, his purpose fulfilled for now. The dust of the road settled behind him, stirred by his deliberate steps, marking the passage of a man who embodied society's darkest necessities. As he walked, the echoes of the crowd's gasps, the sickening thud, and the magistrate's final command played softly in the recesses of his mind. But they were distant, muted, almost detached, like memories from a dream. He allowed them no power, no purchase on his inner world. He had built walls around himself, thick and unyielding, fortified by years of grim experience. This detachment was his shield, his very means of survival in a life that would otherwise consume him whole. He was Marius, the executioner, and his grim dance with death was complete for this day. The last echoes of the dispersing crowd had long faded by the time Marius completed his grim work at the village square. The public spectacle, once alive with the raw energy of fear and morbid curiosity, now lay silent, scarred by the mornings. Terrible ritual. The gallows stood stark against the midday sky, a dark silhouette against the pale heavens, a silent testament to the judgment that had just transpired. The ground beneath it, recently soaked and stained, was now being meticulously covered by Marius. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, devoid of haste or emotion. First, the body. The guards, their initial apprehension replaced by a grim efficiency, would assist in its swift, undignified removal. It was quickly loaded onto Marius's cart, often covered with a coarse burlap sack to shield it from lingering, morbid gazes. The destination was not a hallowed burial ground, but often a small, unmarked plot on the outskirts of the common lands, reserved for the executed, the unclaimed, or those whose deaths were deemed too unclean for sacred ground. Marius would ensure. Its burial was quick, shallow, and unceremonious, a practical matter of public hygiene and final disposal. No prayers were said, no crosses marked the spot. Just earth returning to earth, hastened by the hand of the executioner. Once the body was gone, Marius turned his attention to the site itself. The blood, dark and congealed, had to be removed. He would fetch buckets of water from the nearest well, drawing it with a strong rhythmic pull, the squeak of the well rope, a jarring sound in the sudden quiet. He poured the water over the stained earth, then scrubbed it with rough brushes, working with a relentless determination. The water would turn crimson, then brown, before finally running clear. He would then scatter fresh earth or sand over the area, a futile attempt to erase the memory, though the stain would forever linger in the collective consciousness of the village. Next, his tools. The axe, still gleaming with a chilling sharpness, was wiped meticulously clean with a coarse cloth, then polished with oil until its blade shone with a cold metallic gleam. The rope, which had tightened with terrible finality, was carefully coiled, its fibers inspected for any fraying or weakness. The block, scarred by countless blows, was scrubbed, its surface smoothed where possible. Each implement was restored to its pristine, terrifying readiness, awaiting its next grim summons. There was a particular satisfaction in this methodical cleansing, a sense of order restored to chaos, a quiet return to the familiar rhythms of his isolated life. The entire process was performed under the watchful, albeit distant, eyes of a few lingering villagers. They stood far off, huddled figures at the edges of the square, unable to fully tear themselves away, yet unwilling to approach. Their silence was profound, their gazes a mixture of lingering horror and a strange, almost morbid fascination. Marius ignored them. He had long ago learned to build an impenetrable wall against the outside world's judgment. Their revulsion was as much a part of his existence as the blood he cleansed from the stone. When the last drops of water had been flung, the last grains of sand scattered, and the last tool secured in his cart, Marius took a final sweeping look at the square. It was empty now, save for the gallows, which stood as a grim monument to the day's events. The marketplace, usually bustling with life, remained abandoned as if holding its breath, reluctant to reclaim its purpose so soon after such a profound violation of natural order. He took the donkey's reins, the worn leather familiar in his grasp, and began the slow, solitary walk back to his cottage. The journey felt longer, heavier than the one in the morning. The cheers, the gasps, the terrible thud, they were no longer external sounds, but faint echoes within the cavern of his mind. The scent of blood, though long washed from his hands in the earth, seemed to cling to his nostrils. A phantom odor that would linger for hours. Sometimes dazed out as he walked, the path seemed even more desolate than usual. The trees lining the route appeared to sag under an unseen weight, their branches brittle and dark. The wind, which earlier had carried the murmurs of the crowd, now whispered only through the dry grass, a mournful, solitary sound. He passed no one. The villagers, eager to forget, had retreated into their homes, drawing their curtains, bolting their doors. The world turned its back on him, leaving him to carry the burden of its grim necessities alone. Upon reaching his isolated cottage, the first thing Marius did was to shed his heavy outer clothes, leaving them outside to air, hoping the wind and sun would carry away the lingering taint. He then entered the cottage, the air within smelling faintly of his wife's cooking and the ever-present wood smoke, scents that usually offered comfort, but now felt strangely muted, unable to fully penetrate the wall of his detachment. True cleansing began then. He heated water over the hearth, filling a large wooden tub. He would scrub his hands, his arms, his face with harsh lye soap, rubbing his skin raw, trying to wash away not just the physical grime, but the invisible residue of the day's deed. The steam rose around him, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent that seemed to permeate his very being. He would wash until his skin was red and chafed, until his muscles ached from the effort, until the water turned murky with the grime and the phantom traces of what he had done. It was a futile ritual, perhaps, for the deeper stains resided not on his skin, but in the quiet corners of his soul. While he washed, Alara would move silently around him, placing a fresh tunic, preparing a simple, unadorned meal. She never spoke. Of the day's events, never asked. Her silence was a profound act of compassion, an acknowledgement of the unspeakable, a silent understanding of the burden he carried. Her touch, when it came, was brief and gentle, a fleeting connection that somehow tethered him to the ordinary world, to the fragile warmth of his family. After his thorough washing, the exhaustion would settle in, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that went beyond mere physical exertion. It was the exhaustion of the soul, the weariness of perpetually standing at the precipice of life and death. He would eat his meal in silence, the food tasting like ash in his mouth, the hunger pangs a dull drone against the sharper ache of his spirit. His gaze would often drift to his children, playing quietly in a corner, their innocence a stark, painful contrast to the darkness he embodied. He would wonder what future awaited them, what shadows his profession would cast upon their lives. Would they, too, one day, inherit this solitary burden? The thought was a chilling one, a constant, unspoken fear that gnawed at the edges of his hardened heart as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows across the isolated cottage. Marius would seek the quiet solitude of his straw pallet. Sleep, when it came, was often fitful, plagued by fragmented images and phantom sounds from the day. The condemned's final gasp, the collective sigh of the crowd, the sickening thud, these would replay in a silent, endless loop within his mind. He would often wake in the dead of night, his heart pounding, his body slick with cold sweat, the profound isolation of his existence pressing in on him from all sides. He was the necessary shadow, the unloved hand that served the unyielding demands of medieval justice. His life was a constant cycle of preparation, execution, and cleansing, a grim dance of death and solitude. And as the dark hours of the night consumed his isolated world, Marius knew that no amount of water, no amount of scrubbing, could ever truly wash away the indelible stain of his profession, nor the profound burden of a life lived as the embodiment of fear and finality. Night in the executioner's isolated cottage was rarely a time of true peace. The pervasive silence that enveloped Marius during the day, a constant reminder of his social exclusion, transformed after dusk into a profound, almost oppressive darkness. It was a darkness not just of the absence of light, but of the heavy presence of his thoughts, of the memories that refused to stay buried beneath the stoic facade he presented to the world. Sleep, when it finally claimed him, was a fragile truce, often broken by the relentless echoes of his grim profession. He would lie on his straw pallet, the familiar scent of damp earth and stale wood smoke filling his nostrils, the rough wool, like it a meager comfort against the pervasive chill. Ilara's steady, quiet breathing beside him was a familiar anchor, but even her presence could not fully ward off the phantoms that awaited him in the realm of dreams. His body, weary from the day's physical and emotional toll, would eventually surrender, pulling him down into the labyrinth of unconsciousness. But rest, true, restorative rest, was a luxury rarely afforded to Marius. The nightmares were a constant. companion, a cruel counterpoint to his waking detachment. They rarely consisted of overt violence or graphic gore, for his mind had built formidable defenses against such direct assaults. Instead, they were insidious, more terrifying in their subtlety. He would find himself in vast, echoing spaces, perhaps an empty village square under a perpetually gray sky, where the wind carried not sound, but 1,000 whispered judgments. Or he would stand before an endless line of averted faces, their eyes never meeting his, their silent condemnation, a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Sometimes the dreams were sensory fragments, the precise, chilling thud of the axe, from a specific execution, replaying in an endless loop, devoid of context, just the sound. Or the phantom scent of blood, sharp and metallic, clinging to his breath even as he lay in his own bed. There were dreams of cold, of the biting chill of the gallows at dawn, a cold that seeped into his very bones and lingered long after he woke, leaving him shivering uncontrollably in the warmth of his blankets. One particular dream, more vivid and haunting than others, returned with unsettling frequency. It was not of a public execution, but of a private, almost intimate moment of his work, the breaking of a confession. He saw the face of the accused, not clear, but blurred, indistinct, a mere vessel for suffering. He felt the familiar weight of the tools in his hands, the specific, agonizing twist of the screw, the precise pressure applied to a limb. He heard the muffled, desperate cries, the cracking of bone, the pleas that turned into incoherent gasps. And in the dream, he felt, for a terrifying moment, the pleasure of the power, the control, the absolute dominion over another human being's pain. This was the nightmare that truly chilled him, for it exposed the dark corners of his own soul, the terrifying possibility that the detachment he cultivated might be a thin veil over something far more insidious. He would wake from this dream with a gasp, his heart pounding against his ribs, his body slick with cold sweat, the memory of that fleeting, horrifying pleasure staining his waking thoughts. The psychological toll extended far beyond the realm of sleep. Intrusive thoughts would ambush him during the day, even amidst his mundane chores. A particularly smooth stone by the path might remind him of the polished surface of his axe block. The scent of cooking meat, rarely enjoyed, might conjure the image of flesh, raw and bleeding. The everyday sounds of the distant village, a child's cry, a woman's laugh, would often trigger a wave of profound melancholy, a painful awareness of the normal life that was forever denied to him and his family. He had developed a series of conscious and unconscious coping mechanisms over the years. The most pervasive was absolute detachment. He treated every condemned person as an object, a task, a problem to be solved. He rarely allowed himself to think of their stories, their families, their desperate pleas. Empathy was a luxury he could not afford. It was a weakness that would shatter the fragile walls of his composure. He built an emotional fortress around his true self, a bastion of stoicism that few, if any, could penetrate. Another mechanism was relentless physical labor. When not actively engaged in his duties, Marius would throw himself into the most demanding tasks imaginable, chopping wood with furious, almost manic energy until his muscles screamed in protest, tending his small, isolated plot of land with a grim determination, tearing at the stubborn earth with his bare hands. He sought exhaustion, a physical weariness so profound it would hopefully silence the restless whispers of his mind and grant him a few hours of dreamless oblivion. His silence, too, was a form of self-preservation. Words carried weight, acknowledged. Connection expressed emotion. Marius spoke little, even to Alara, even to his children. He communicated through gestures, through actions, through the unspoken understanding that flowed between them. His quietness was a shield, preventing him from revealing the raw, festering wounds of his soul, and also protecting him from the uncomfortable intrusion of others' words, their judgments, their pity. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, when the nightmares had driven him from his pallet, he would sit by the dying embers of the hearth, seeking solace in the flickering light. He would stare into the glowing coals, their transient warmth a fleeting comfort against the cold within him. In these moments, rare and precious, he would allow himself to simply be, without the burden of his profession, without the weight of societal condemnation. He would listen to the wind rattling the wattle walls, or the distant hoot of an owl, finding a strange, desolate peace in the profound isolation. He remembered a particular execution, years ago, that had lodged itself deep within his memory, refusing to be purged by the usual rituals of detachment. It was a young woman, no older than his eldest son was now, accused of witchcraft. Her eyes, filled not with defiance, but with a profound, terrified innocence, had somehow pierced his carefully constructed defenses. She had cried out, not for mercy, but for her mother, her voice a thin, desperate thread against the roar of the crowd. Even as he had performed his duty with practiced efficiency, her voice had echoed in his mind, a dissonant chord in the symphony of his detachment. For weeks afterward, her face, her innocent plea, had haunted his waking hours, her cries infiltrating his dreams, leaving him gasping in the darkness. He had doubled his physical labor, sharpened his tools with a furious intensity, deepened his silence, anything to drown out the echoes of that one singular instance where his shield had momentarily fractured. This constant psychological battle was the unseen part of his burden, the true answer to why his profession was a bad thing. It wasn't just the act of taking a life. It was the slow, relentless erosion of his own humanity. It was the forced detachment, the suppression of empathy, the constant vigilance against the tides of madness. He was required to be less than human to perform a task that only humans could conceive of. And that paradox, that inherent contradiction, gnawed at his soul with a quiet, persistent MALEVOLENCE dot as the first faint streaks of dawn appeared on the horizon, painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and pale gray. Marius would rise from his fitful slumber, or from his solitary vigil by the hearth. The nightmares would recede, replaced by the grim reality of the waking world. He would tend to the fire, prepare the meager morning meal, his movements as methodical and silent as ever. But deep within, the shadows of the night, the echoes of the dreams would linger, a constant reminder of the unseen price he paid for his isolated existence, for his role as the necessary, unloved instrument of medieval justice. The sun, when it finally reached Marius's isolated cottage, did little to dispel the lingering chill that clung to its walls, nor the deeper, more pervasive cold that seeped into the lives of his family. Alara, his wife, moved with a quiet resignation, her life a constant, unspoken testament to the burden of her husband's profession. Their children, 2 boys on the cusp of adolescence and a younger girl, knew no other existence. Their childhood was a peculiar, insulated world, shaped by the pervasive shadow of their father's calling. Alara's days were a ceaseless cycle of domestic labor, much like any peasant woman's. Yet hers was tinged with a unique solitude. While other wives might gather at the village well, sharing gossip and laughter, Alara fetched her water from their own isolated well, its wooden bucket perpetually creaking in the silence. While other women might spin wool together, their hands a blur of communal industry, Alara spun alone by her hearth, the soft hum of her spindle the only sound. Her face, though often weary, held a quiet strength, a stoicism born of enduring, what most others could not even imagine. She rarely spoke of Marius's work, not to him, and certainly not to the children. But the knowledge was always there, a heavy, unspoken presence that permeated their small home. Her love for him was a quiet, fierce flame, burning steadfastly against the cold winds of societal condemnation. It was a love that had chosen to stand with the outcast, to share his burden, a testament to a bond forged in shared solitude. Children, too, lived in a world apart. They knew, intuitively, from a very young age, that their family was different. They were never explicitly told of their father's profession by their parents. It was a truth conveyed through the silent language of averted gazes, of whispers that died on the wind as they approached, of doors that subtly closed when they neared the village proper. They saw the fear, the revulsion, the morbid fascination. In the eyes of other adults, eyes that quickly darted away if met. This silent ostracization was their first and most enduring lesson in the harsh realities of their heritage. Their play, if it could be called that, was confined to the immediate vicinity of the cottage. They chased each other through the thorny, scrubland, built crude forts from fallen branches, or fashioned dolls from scraps of cloth and straw. They learned to rely on each other for companionship, their bond tighter, more fiercely protective than that of most siblings. There were no other children to join their games, no shared secrets with village youngsters. Their laughter, when it came, was often soft, quickly stifled, as if even joy had to be guarded in this place. Marius's eldest son, Thomas, was nearing the age where he would soon join his father in the more demanding tasks, perhaps even be initiated into the grim secrets of the profession. Thomas, a quiet boy with his father's solid build and his mother's observant eyes, already felt the weight of his future. He helped his father with the disposal of animal carcasses, his small hands learning to grapple with the hooks, his young stomach churning at the stench, but never complaining. He watched his father sharpen the axes, his gaze steady, absorbing every meticulous movement, understanding that this knowledge, grim as it was his inheritance. He understood the unspoken truth. He was destined to follow in his father's footsteps, to take on the mantle of the executioner for no one else. This was not a choice. It was a birthright, a curse passed down through generations. His younger brother, Finn, was more spirited, more prone to youthful outbursts of frustration against their imposed isolation. He yearned for the bustling sounds of the village, for the rough-and-tumble games played by other boys on the village green. He would sometimes stray too close to the village limits, drawn by the sounds of distant laughter, only to be met by a swift, cold glare from an adult, or the sudden, nervous calls of other children being pulled away. He would return to the cottage, his face flushed with anger and hurt, the sting of rejection, a raw wound. Elara would comfort him silently, her hand gently stroking his hair, her eyes conveying a world of understanding and shared sorrow. Marius would simply watch, his expression unreadable, knowing that Finn's pain was an inevitable part of their existence. Their sister, Lyra, was the youngest, still largely sheltered by her mother's presence. She spent her days at Elara's side, learning to spin, to weave, to mend. Her world was even smaller, confined mostly to the cottage and its immediate yard. She would often sit by the window, gazing out at the distant village, her small face filled with a quiet longing. She understood the unspoken rules, that they were different, that they were set apart, but the full, brutal truth of why remained a vague, unsettling cloud in her young mind. Her future, too, was constrained. Marriage prospects for the daughter of an executioner, were virtually non-existent in the eyes of respectable villagers. She was destined for a life of quiet companionship, perhaps a shared household with her brothers. If they ever found peace, the silence within the cottage was often profound, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire, the rustle of straw, or the quiet sounds of their labor. There were no loud arguments, no boisterous conversations. Each member of the family seemed to carry their own unspoken burden, their own quiet grief for the life they could not have. Yet within this silence, there was also a deep, abiding connection, a powerful sense of unity forged in their shared isolation. They were all they had. Their love for each other was a fiercely guarded treasure, a bastion against the relentless tide of societal condemnation. Sometimes, a traveling peddler, brave or desperate enough, would venture near their cottage, drawn by the slim hope of trade. Their approach would be cautious, their eyes darting nervously. Alara would conduct the transaction quickly, exchanging a few preserved vegetables or a freshly woven piece of cloth for a rare needle, a bit of salt, or a small, precious amount of medicine. These were fleeting, impersonal encounters conducted with a respectful distance, the peddler eager to conclude the business and retreat to the safer confines of the village. The children would watch from the doorway, their faces pressed against the frame, observing these rare glimpses of the outside world, these fleeting connections with humanity that always ended with an abrupt departure. The weight of the future was a constant, unspoken presence, particularly for Marius and Alara. They knew that when Marius grew too old or too infirm, Thomas would have to step into his role. There was no other option. The executioner's family was responsible for providing. The next executioner. It was a grim inheritance, a curse passed down through blood. Marius would watch Thomas, noting his growing strength, the quiet determination in his eyes, and a deep, agonizing sorrow would settle in his heart. He wished a different life for his son, a life free from the haunting shadows and the pervasive loneliness. But wishes were luxuries, and their lives were dictated by a harsher reality. As dusk settled over the isolated cottage, casting long, mournful shadows across the sparse interior, the family would gather around the hearth. The firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating the lines of weariness, the quiet strength, the unspoken anxieties. Marius would sit, his large hands resting on his knees, his gaze often fixed on the dancing flames. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a solid, unwavering anchor. Alara would tend to the children, her quiet ministrations a balm against the day's harshness. Their nights were a shared silence, punctuated by the sounds of the wind and the distant cries of night. Creatures. Each member of the family carried their own specific burdens, yet they carried them together in unspoken solidarity. They were the executioner's family, living on the fringes, forever separate, forever marked. Their survival was not just physical, but also emotional, a testament to their deep bonds forged in a world that sought to condemn them. And as they drifted into the restless sleep of the isolated, the enduring love within their small, shadowed home burned like a defiant, flickering ember against the vast, unforgiving darkness that lay beyond its walls. While the dramatic spectacle of public execution defined Marius's most feared role, it was the other duties that truly underscored his complete ostracization from medieval society. These were the tasks no one else would touch, grim necessities that kept the village functioning, yet further cemented his identity as the ultimate outsider. For Marius, these were not merely chores. They were a constant, physical reminder of his uncleanness, a perpetual state of being that clung to his skin, seeped into his clothes, and pervaded his very existence. One of the most frequent of these grim assignments was the disposal of animal carcasses. In a society where livestock was vital for survival, an animal's death, whether from disease, accident, or old age, brought not just economic loss, but also the immediate threat of pestilence. While a farmer might handle the burial on his own, prized ox, the death of a lesser creature, or a stray, or a beast that succumbed on a communal path, often fell to Marius. Villagers would simply leave the dead animals near the invisible boundary of his isolated property, a silent, pungent summons. He would equip himself with heavy leather gloves, a long iron hook, and his sturdy two-wheeled cart. The stench was, often overpowering, a putrid cloud that clung to the air, particularly in the warmer months. Flies, thick and buzzing, would swarm around the bloated bodies, a grotesque halo of decay. Marius moved with practiced efficiency, his face set in a grim mask, his breath held against the suffocating odor. He would grapple with the stiff limbs, the hide often slick with bodily fluids, dragging the heavy carcass onto his cart with immense effort. The labor was backbreaking, each movement a testament to the raw physicality demanded by his unwanted duties. The destination was always the same: the dead ground, a secluded, forgotten hollow nestled deep within the least desirable part of the common lands, far from any path or dwelling. Here the earth was shallow, often rocky, but it was the designated place for all that was deemed refuse. Marius would dig a crude, shallow pit, sufficient only to cover the bulk of the creature before heaving the heavy carcass into its final resting place. No prayers were said, no blessings given, just the quick, efficient covering of earth, practical act to prevent the spread of disease and the foul odor. He would return home, his body aching, the putrid smell clinging stubbornly to his clothes and skin, a constant, unwanted perfume that only deep scrubbing with harsh lye soap could. Begin to diminish dot beyond the dead animals, Marius was also the designated handler of the truly abhorrent, lepers. While lepers were not typically put to death, their existence was a living death, a terrifying ostracism from all human contact. When a villager was diagnosed with leprosy, confirmed by the local priest or a traveling physician, they were given their leper's clapper, a wooden rattle to warn others of their approach, and exiled to isolated leper colonies, or simply cast out to wander. Marius was often the one tasked with escorting them from the village, ensuring they reached their designated distant isolation. It was a journey made in silence, the leper's clapper providing a mournful, rhythmic counterpoint to their solitary footsteps. Marius felt no personal animosity, only a profound sense of sadness for their terrible fate, and a grim understanding of the fear that drove society to such extremes. During times of plague or other widespread pestilence, Marius's duties expanded to include the most harrowing task of all, the disposal of human corpses. When the Black Death swept through the land, or a wave of sweating sickness emptied homes, the fear was so profound that even family members would abandon their dead, leaving them to lie in their beds or on their floors. The air would grow thick with the stench of death, a terrifying harbinger of the disease's relentless march. It was Marius, and sometimes his eldest son Thomas, who would bravely or resignedly enter these silent, cursed homes, clad in a simple, heavy linen tunic and thick gloves, primitive protection against an unseen enemy. Marius would gather the cooling bodies. There was no time for shrouds, no thought for dignity. He would simply hoist them onto his cart, sometimes stacking several, their limbs stiff and awkward. The carts, once used for animal carcasses, now bore the silent, grim payload of human lives extinguished. The procession to the communal grave pit, often a hastily dug trench on the common burial grounds, was a haunting one. The streets, usually bustling, were utterly deserted, the silence broken only by the creak of the cartwheels and the distant, mournful tolling of a church bell. The living, huddled in their homes, prayed that Marius would not have to visit there. Door next dotted the pit, he would simply tip the cart, sending the bodies tumbling into the shallow grave. Lime would be scattered over them, a crude attempt at disinfection, before the earth was quickly thrown over, sealing them from sight. There were no priests, no blessings, no solemn rites. Only the grim efficiency of the executioner, battling against the tide of death to protect the living. These were the times when Marius felt the weight of his office most acutely, not as an instrument of punishment, but as a silent, unthanked guardian against the utter breakdown of society. The invisible threat, the countless dead, the terror in the eyes of the few survivors, it all pressed in on him, leaving him profoundly shaken, a tremor beneath his hardened exterior. Paradoxically, in some communities, the executioner also inherited certain rudimentary healing duties, or rather, tasks involving pain and blood that no respected physician or barber surgeon would deign to perform. If a villager had a tooth that needed pulling, putrid and agonizing, and no proper healer was available, they might, in desperation, turn to Marius. His strong, calloused hands, accustomed to instruments of force, might wield a crude pair of tongs to yank the offending molar. If a broken bone needed setting, and the local bone setter was absent or unwilling to deal with a particularly gruesome compound fracture, Marius might be summoned. His knowledge of anatomy, albeit from a grim perspective, coupled with his capacity to inflict and withstand pain, made him a reluctant, last-resort healer for the most desperate cases. He performed these tasks with the same detached efficiency as his executions, but perhaps with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of unexpected empathy. For these were not condemned souls, but fellow villagers in agonizing pain. Yet, even in these rare acts of crude healing, he remained the outcast, the one who dealt with the foulest aspects of human suffering, the smell of decay, of sickness, of fear. These were the constant companions of Marius, the executioner. They clung to his clothes, permeated his home, and seemed to seep into his very skin. No amount of washing, no amount of fresh air, could fully rid him of the pervasive taint. This was the true, often unseen, badness of his profession. It wasn't just the public act of execution, but the endless, thankless, and utterly reviled duties he performed in the shadows. He was the cleanser of society's refuse, the guardian against its hidden horrors. Yet for this essential service, he was paid in ostracization, fear, and a profound, inescapable solitude. His life was a testament to the bitter irony of his position. Indispensable, yet untouchable. Vital, yet condemned. For Marius, the village was a distant, often abstract concept. It was the source of his grim summons, the stage for his public duties, and the origin of the averted glances. Yet it remained, for the most part, a place he observed from the periphery, a vibrant, bustling entity from which he was eternally barred. His isolated cottage was not just a home. It was a physical manifestation of his exclusion, a constant reminder of the life he could never fully inhabit. On rare occasions, however, the demands of his other duties, or an urgent summons, would necessitate a deeper venture into the heart of the community. These were not public executions, but perhaps the collection of a particularly troublesome carcass from within the village limits, or the escort of a dangerously ill individual to a quarantine dwelling. For Marius, these journeys were a unique torment, a painful juxtaposition of his solitary existence with the vibrant, noisy tapestry of communal life. As he walked through the narrow, winding streets, pulling his empty cart or carrying his grim tools, the sounds of the village would, assault his senses. The distant clatter of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle from the communal byre, the shrill cries of children playing in the muddy lanes. These were the everyday sounds of life, rhythms that beat within the walls of the village, creating a symphony of human existence from which he was perpetually out of tune. He heard the murmur of conversations, the laughter from a tavern, the gentle hum of a weaver's loom, each sound a tiny, poignant reminder of the normalcy he could only observe from afar. The scents, too, were a vibrant tapestry he rarely experienced. The rich, earthy smell of baking bread wafting from the communal oven, mingled with the sweet aroma of brewing ale, the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from countless hearths, and the sharp, clean smell of freshly laundered linen drying on. Lines. These were the sense of home, of community, of belonging, fragrances that evoked a deep, almost painful yearning in a man whose own life was defined by the acrid tang of decay and the metallic scent of blood. But it was the visual landscape of the village that provided the most acute contrast to his isolated world. He would see the farmers leading their livestock, their hands stained with earth, but their faces open. He would pass women gossiping by the well, their voices light, their faces etched with the everyday concerns of family and harvest. Children, small and energetic, would dart through the lanes, their laughter carefree, their innocence a stark, almost unbearable sight. He observed the casual touch of a neighbor's hand on another's arm, the easy shared smiles, the comfort of familiarity. These were the unspoken rituals of community, the subtle cues of human connection that Marius, by virtue of his profession, was forever excluded from. Their reactions to his presence were a practiced, almost synchronized performance. As Marius entered a street, a ripple of strained silence would precede him. Conversations would die, laughter would cease, heads would turn away abruptly. Doors would subtly, almost imperceptibly, close. Children would be swiftly pulled inside by their mothers, their faces averted, their small bodies shielded from his sight. It was not overtly hostile, not usually. It was a quieter, more insidious form of rejection. It was the palpable sense of avoidance, of people holding their breath until he had passed, an invisible wall erected around him wherever he went. He had learned long ago not to meet their eyes. A direct gaze from the executioner was seen as an ill omen, a curse, a direct confrontation with the dark forces he embodied. He kept his own gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression impassive, his jaw tight. He was a shadow moving through light, a silent, necessary disruption to their normal rhythm. To acknowledge their fear, their revulsion, their contempt, was to acknowledge his own pain, and that was a luxury he could not afford. His stoicism was his shield, his only defense against a world that saw him as little more than a necessary monster. Sometimes he would overhear snippets of conversation, hushed and quickly silenced as he drew near. A mother warning her child, "Don't look, little one." A man muttering, "The devil's work," under his breath. The words, though not meant for him, would find their way to his ears, reinforcing the narrative spun around him, the pervasive belief in his inherent uncleanness. He was the carrier of contagion, the harbinger of misfortune, the man tainted by death. And the villagers, in their simple, superstitious faith, believed that even his shadow could bring ill luck. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when a flash of something else would cross a villager's face. Not just fear, but perhaps a flicker of pity or a momentary curiosity. A young woman might glance at him too long, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and intrigue, before quickly looking away. An old man, perhaps hardened by life, might meet his gaze for a split second, a profound weariness in his own eyes, a silent acknowledgement of shared human suffering. But these moments were ephemeral, quickly swallowed by the pervasive tide of aversion. The church, a towering presence at the heart of the village, was another place where Marius felt the profound weight of his exclusion. He could not enter its hallowed doors during Mass. His presence would desecrate the sacred space, pollute the consecrated ground. He was barred from the sacraments, from communion, from the solace of collective prayer. He could only stand outside, in the cold, observing the villagers enter and exit, their faces softened by devotion, their voices raised in hymns he was forbidden to join. He was a man without absolution, perpetually damned in the eyes of the church, for his duties were seen as a necessary evil that stained the soul irrevocably. His visits to the market, when they occurred, were equally fraught with unspoken tension. Merchants would serve him quickly, their hands barely touching his coin, their eyes avoiding his. The produce he purchased was handed to him with a grim haste, as if prolonged contact would somehow contaminate their goods. Other shoppers would clear a path around him, creating an uncomfortable void. He would complete his transactions in silence, his large frame a solitary sentinel amidst the bustling crowd, then retreat as swiftly as possible, the unwanted attention, a tangible weight on his shoulders as he concluded his grim task within. The village, whether it was disposing of a dead animal or escorting a leper, Marius would turn his back on the vibrant heart of the community and begin his solitary trek back to his isolated cottage. The sounds of the village would slowly recede, the scents would dissipate, and the faces would become distant blurs. The silence of his own property would welcome him, a familiar, if desolate, embrace. He was the dark mirror of medieval society, reflecting its deepest fears, its most brutal necessities, and its unforgiving judgments. He existed on the edge, a figure of terror and essential service, forever bound to a life lived in the shadow of collective aversion. The village, in its bustling life, was a world he could never fully belong to, a vibrant tapestry from which his thread had been meticulously, brutally, and eternally cut. And as he closed the door of his cottage behind him, shutting out the last echoes of the distant communal world, Marius returned to the profound, unyielding solitude that was his true and only home. Time, in the isolated world of Marius the executioner, flowed not in days or weeks, but in the relentless, cyclical progression of his duties, and the quiet, almost imperceptible growth of his children. His own body, once a formidable fortress of strength, had begun to show the slow, inevitable marks of age. The ache in his joints was deeper, more constant, and the swiftness of his movements, though still precise, carried a subtle slowness. He was a man approaching the twilight of his active years, and with that realization came the chilling, inescapable truth of his profession, the burden of inheritance. His eldest son, Thomas, was no longer a child. He stood on the precipice of manhood, his frame growing into the solid build of his father, his hands already calloused and strong from years of labor on their small plot in assisting with his father's other duties. Thomas was a quiet boy, much like Marius, with an inner stillness that masked a keen observational mind. He had watched, absorbed, and learned, not through explicit instruction for the most part, but through the silent, lived example of his father's existence. He knew with an understanding far beyond his years that his future was not one of choice, but of destiny, carved out by the bloodline he carried. Marius would often observe Thomas, his gaze long and heavy, as the boy went about his tasks. He saw the developing strength in his son's arms as he chopped wood, the steady gaze when he helped to dispose of a fallen animal, the quiet resignation in his eyes as a villager hastily averted their face. Marius saw himself in Thomas, not just physically, but in the nascent stoicism, the growing detachment, the subtle hardening of the spirit that was the necessary armor for their grim calling. And with that recognition came a profound aching, sorrow. He had never spoken to Thomas directly about the axe, the gallows, the public spectacle. The topic was a heavy, unspoken truth that hung in the air between them, a shared secret that defined their relationship. But now, as Marius felt the grip of time on his own strength, the need for direct instruction became urgent. The passing of the torch, though dreaded, had to be meticulously managed to ensure the continuity of justice for the village, and the survival of his family. Their lessons began subtly, almost imperceptibly, blurring the lines between father-son instruction and professional training. Marius would have Thomas spend more time in the workshop, cleaning and oiling the smaller tools. He would talk in low, gruff tones, not of execution, but of the properties of steel, the strength of different woods, the precise balance of an instrument. "Feel the weight, Thomas," Marius would murmur, handing his son a smaller axe. "Understand how it moves. It is an extension of your arm, your will." Thomas would nod, his young face solemn, his eyes absorbing every detail, every nuanced movement of his father's hands. Then came the deeper lessons. Marius would take Thomas to the dead ground, not just to dispose of an animal, but to study the earth, its varying resistance, the effort required to dig. He would point out the subtle signs of decay, the way disease spread, imparting knowledge. That was vital for their role as the village's unseen guardians against pestilence. He taught him about the knots, not just simple binding knots, but the more complex, precise hangman's knot, demonstrating its construction with slow, deliberate movements, emphasizing the importance of its clean, quick action. Thomas learned not just the how, but the grim why behind each detail. The psychological training, though unspoken, was perhaps the most crucial. Marius taught Thomas, by example, the art of detachment. He rarely showed emotion, keeping his face a mask, his voice a monotone. He encouraged Thomas to observe, but not to judge, to act, but not to feel. "It is a task," Marius had once grunted, "a rare direct instruction. No more, no less. The law demands it. We merely serve the law." He taught Thomas to focus on the mechanics, on the efficiency, on the completion of the duty, rather than the humanity of the condemned. It was a brutal lesson, a necessary hardening of the spirit to survive the horrors they would witness and inflict. Thomas rarely pushed back. He understood. His resistance, if any, was internal, a silent ache that he learned to suppress, just as his father had. He saw the fear in the eyes of other villagers, the quick avoidance when he was near. He heard the whispers, the unspoken judgments. He knew that his father's life, and his own destined future, was one of profound isolation, a grim inheritance passed from one solitary man to the next. For Marius, seeing his son embrace this grim future brought a complex swirl of emotions. There was a sense of relief that the line would continue, that the village would have its necessary, albeit despised, guardian. But there was also a deep, almost suffocating wave of sorrow. He looked at Thomas, at his quiet strength, his growing competence, and saw the loss of innocence, the extinguishing of youthful dreams before they had even fully ignited. He wished, with a longing that transcended his usual stoicism, for a different path for his son, a life of simple joys and unburdened connection. But such wishes were luxuries they could not afford. Their very existence was dictated by the unyielding demands of their world. ELARA. 2. Watched this grim transition with a quiet, profound sadness. Her eldest son, the boy she had nurtured, was slowly being molded into the very image of his father's burden. She saw the light in his eyes dim slightly, replaced by a subtle hardness. She heard the increasing silence in his movements, the growing detachment in his gaze. Her heart ached for him, for the lost childhood, for the inevitable loneliness that awaited him. She would sometimes linger over his sleeping form, her hand gently tracing the lines of his face, a silent prayer escaping her lips for a grace they could never truly receive. The younger children, Finn and Lyra, sensed the shift in their elder brother. Thomas, once a playful if quiet companion, was now more withdrawn, his lessons with their father taking up more of his time and focus. They understood, with the innate perception of children, that something profound was happening, something that would further deepen the chasm between their family and the rest of the world. Their own futures, too, were implicitly tied to this. Inheritance. Lyra's marriage prospects would remain non-existent. Finn would continue to wrestle with the frustration of his isolation. One cold evening, as Marius and Thomas sat by the hearth, cleaning and sharpening the executioner's tools, a profound silence settled between them. The only sound was the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, the soft hiss of oil, the crackle of the fire. Marius looked at his son, his eyes, usually so guarded, holding a rare depth of emotion. "It is a heavy blade, Thomas," he murmured, his voice rough, unused to such direct intimacy. "And a heavier burden. You must be strong, not just in arm, but in spirit." Thomas met his father's gaze, his own eyes holding a nascent understanding. "I know, Father," he replied, his voice low, firm. It was not a statement of eager acceptance, but of quiet, grim resolution. He understood the profound cost, the immense sacrifice. He understood that his life would be one of perpetual solitude, a necessary monster in the eyes of the world. But he also understood that this was his destiny, his duty, passed down through generations. He was the next link in the chain, the next shadow to serve society's darkest necessities dot. And as Marius watched his son, seeing the clear, unwavering acceptance in his eyes, a strange mix of pride and despair filled his heart. The legacy would continue. The village would have its executioner. But the price, for both father and son, was a profound and indelible mark on their very souls, a testament to the unending burden of an inheritance forged in iron and silence. Even in a life as bleak and isolated as Marius the executioner's, fragments of humanity, fleeting and precious, occasionally pierced the pervasive darkness. These were not grand gestures or moments of public acclaim, for such things were forever denied to him. Instead, they were subtle whispers of connection, quiet acts of kindness, or moments of profound, unburdened reflection that offered a rare glimpse into the man beneath the hardened shell. They were testament to the stubborn resilience of the human spirit, even when forced to dwell in the deepest shadows. One such moment might arise from his other duties. Perhaps while retrieving a dead animal from a remote, forgotten corner of a field, he would stumble upon a small, injured creature, a fledgling bird fallen from its nest, its delicate wing twisted at an unnatural angle, or a rabbit caught in a crude snare left by a careless hunter, its eyes wide with terror and pain. Most villagers, encountering such a sight, would simply leave it to its fate, deeming it God's will or an insignificant trifle. Some might even put it out of its misery with a swift, brutal stomp. But Marius, whose hands were accustomed to ending lives with terrible finality, would sometimes find himself compelled to offer a different touch. He would approach the suffering animal slowly, his large frame somehow softening, his usually grim expression unreadable. His calloused fingers, so adept at gripping axe hafts and tightening ropes, would gently, almost tenderly, examine the fragile limb. He might carefully mend the bird's broken wing with splints fashioned from tiny, flexible twigs found on the ground, bound with strands of soft grass he meticulously separated. He'd create a makeshift nest from woven dry leaves, placing the small creature within, whispering words that were not quite words, but soft, guttural sounds of comfort that no one would ever hear. Or if it was the rabbit, he'd patiently, painstakingly, work to free its struggling leg from the unforgiving wire of the snare, his breath held, his movements precise, until the creature, startled but unbound, would dart away into the undergrowth, a fleeting flash of white. Marius would watch it vanish, a quiet, unidentifiable satisfaction settling in his chest. These were small, secret acts, witnessed by no one but the silent trees and the indifferent sky, acts that defied the grim nature of his public role. They were his own quiet rebellion against the dehumanizing aspects of his profession, a silent affirmation of a gentler self he guarded fiercely from the world. Another instance might involve an unexpected interaction with a fellow outcast, someone society had cast aside, much like himself. The medieval world was full of those who lived on its fringes, wandering hermits seeking spiritual isolation, beggars ravaged by disease and starvation, or madmen driven from their villages by fear and superstition. One bitter winter's day, while traversing a desolate path to dispose of a frozen carcass, Marius might encounter such a figure, an old woman, perhaps, collapsed by the side of the road, shivering violently, her tattered cloak offering meager defense against the biting wind, her eyes clouded with hunger and despair. Most villagers would pass by, crossing themselves and averting their eyes, fearing contagion or ill fortune, convinced that such souls were touched by evil. But Marius, who understood the profound cold of isolation better than anyone, whose life was a mirror to their own societal abandonment, would sometimes stop. He would carefully lay down his tools, the metallic clatter jarring in the quiet air. He might then offer a meager portion of his own gruel, carefully scooped from the small pouch he carried for his own sustenance, or a rough woolen scrap from his cart for warmth. His movements would be brusque, his face unreadable, offering no pity, no judgment, merely a silent, almost involuntary act of shared survival. There would be no words, no exchange of names, no prolonged eye contact, only a brief, silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, a fleeting moment of raw, unvarnished compassion between two souls deemed unworthy by the world. The other outcast, recognizing the unique understanding in Marius's silent gesture, might offer a single, profound nod of gratitude, a look in their eyes that recognized not the terrifying executioner, but a shared human in a profoundly cold world. These encounters were rare, like precious jewels scattered on a barren landscape, but they left a lingering warmth in Marius's otherwise desolate spirit, a whisper that he was not entirely alone in his fundamental separation. His children, despite their isolated upbringing and the shadow it cast, were also frequent sources of these fleeting moments, anchors tethering him to a purer form of humanity. His daughter, Lyra, often sat by the small leaded window, her slender fingers busy with spinning wool or mending clothes, her small brow furrowed in concentration. One quiet evening, Marius, observing her from the corner of his eye as he cleaned his boots by the hearth, might notice her struggle with a particularly tangled thread, her frustration palpable in the subtle tightening of her shoulders. Without a word, he would take the work from her, his large, calloused fingers, so adept at handling the raw power of the axe and the unyielding strength of the rope, surprisingly nimble as he meticulously untangled the stubborn knots with effortless ease, his touch gentle and precise. He would hand it back to her, the problem solved, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes would meet hers filled with a quiet admiration and gratitude that shone brightly in the dim light, his with a tenderness rarely seen. It was a simple act, a silent lesson in patience and skill, yet it spoke volumes, a testament to the quiet, protective love that existed within their shadowed home, a love shielded from the prying eyes of the outside world. Even Alara, his stoic, enduring wife, could evoke these moments of shared, unspoken humanity. After a particularly harrowing day one, where the stench of death from a disposal lingered even after his meticulous cleansing rituals, or a memory from a grim execution haunted his waking hours, Marius might find himself sitting by the dying embers of the hearth, lost in the depths of his exhaustion and inner turmoil. Ilara, attuned to his unspoken anguish, would move silently, her presence a soft, comforting hum in the quiet cottage. Without a word, she might simply place a warmed mug of weak ale or soothing herbal tea into his large, rough hands. Her touch, as she did so, would be light, a brief, fleeting brush of her fingers against his, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor in his storm-tossed soul. In that moment, feeling the warmth of the mug seeping into his chilled palms, sensing her quiet strength and profound understanding that transcended words, Marius would experience a rare, profound sense of being seen, truly seen, not as the dreaded executioner, but as the weary, burdened man beneath the layers of steel and silence. It was a shared silence, a communion of two souls bound by an extraordinary, isolating burden, finding solace in each other's unspoken, steadfast presence. Perhaps the most poignant of these moments were Marius's solitary reflections under the vast, indifferent night sky, when the moon was full, a luminous pearl in the velvet blackness, casting long, stark shadows across the thorny scrubland around his cottage. He would sometimes step outside. He'd stand for long periods, head tilted, back, gazing at the myriad stars, countless pinpricks of light scattered across the immense canvas of the heavens. In these moments, away from the judgmental eyes of man, away from the grim reality of his tools and duties, away from the phantom smells of death and the echoes of cries, Marius would allow himself a fleeting, desperate escape. He would ponder the sheer immensity of the cosmos, the silent, eternal dance of the celestial bodies, feeling his own existence, his own tragic role, shrink into utter insignificance against the backdrop of infinity. It was in these quiet moments that he could momentarily shed the crushing weight of his identity, becoming simply a man beneath the stars, a small, transient spark in the vast, indifferent universe. There was a strange comfort in this insignificance, a temporary release from the heavy chains of his earthly burden, a whisper of freedom that no human law could ever take away. He was a speck, a fleeting breath, and in that humbling realization, he found a fragile, temporary peace. These fleeting glimpses of humanity were not enough to erase the profound loneliness or the indelible stain of his profession. They were not powerful enough to lift the crushing burden of his soul or to magically change the grim destiny that awaited his son. But they were enough to keep the embers of his spirit from dying out completely, to prevent the dehumanization from becoming absolute. They were tiny, hidden victories, whispers of grace in a life defined by grim necessity. They reminded him that even the most reviled, the most isolated, the most burdened of men could still possess and quietly express the enduring, fragile essence of being human. They were the silent tears he could not shed, the unvoiced prayers he could not utter, the hidden acts of kindness that affirmed his existence beyond the blade and the rope. And as the distant hoot of an owl echoed in the deep quiet of the night, Marius, the executioner, stood as a testament to the stubborn, quiet resilience of the human spirit, even when trapped in the darkest of roles, forever seeking those tiny sparks of light in the overwhelming shadow. The years had etched deeper lines onto Marius's face, tracing the paths of countless sleepless nights and the weight of untold burdens. His once formidable frame, though still solid, carried a new, persistent ache. The vibrant hues of his hair had long since faded to a steely gray, mirroring the landscape of his soul. His son, Thomas, now stood as tall and broad as Marius once had, his movements possessing the same grim efficiency, the same practiced detachment. The torch had been passed, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, inevitable shifting of responsibility. Marius now spent most of his days in the cottage, tending to the small garden, mending tools, or simply sitting by the hearth, observing the quiet life that unfolded around him. He watched Thomas leave with the cart, or return with the telltale scent clinging to his clothes, and a profound, complex mix of relief and sorrow would settle in his heart. Relief that the gruesome duty was no longer his alone. Sorrow for the life his son now led, a mirror of his own. His memories, once suppressed behind a wall of stoicism, now surfaced with an unsettling clarity, particularly in the quiet hours of the night. He remembered his own childhood, a fleeting period of innocence before the shadow of the axe fell upon him. He saw himself, a small boy, helping his father polish the very tools Thomas now wielded, his young mind not yet comprehending the terrible purpose they served. He recalled the first execution he witnessed, the sickening thud echoing in his ears, and the profound physical nausea that had twisted his gut. His father, a silent, grim figure, had offered no comfort, only a steady hand on his shoulder, a silent testament to the unavoidable reality. He remembered the early days of his own tenure, the initial struggles against the pervasive guilt, desperate attempts to wash away the invisible stain that clung to him. He remembered Ilara, her quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, the unspoken understanding that had been their lifeline in a world that condemned them. He remembered his children, their guarded laughter, their fleeting moments of joy, overshadowed by the knowledge that their future, too, was inextricably bound to this cursed lineage. The badness of being an executioner, he now understood with a clarity that stung, was not merely the act of taking a life. It was the relentless social ostracism, the pervasive fear and revulsion in the eyes of others that built an impenetrable wall around him and his family. It was the profound, soul-crushing loneliness, the constant awareness of being an essential, yet utterly despised outsider, barred from the most basic human connections. It was the psychological toll, the nightmares that haunted his sleep, the intrusive thoughts that ambushed his waking hours, the perpetual struggle to maintain detachment lest madness claim him. It was the physical burden of the grim, unclean duties, the disposal of decaying animals, the burial of plague victims, the handling of leper's tasks that clung to his skin and permeated his very being. And perhaps most agonizingly, it was the burden of inheritance, the tragic knowledge that this life, this curse, would be passed on to his beloved son, perpetuating the cycle of isolation and silent suffering for another generation. He thought of the many faces he had seen on the gallows, not their crimes, but their final expressions: defiance, terror, resignation, sometimes even a strange, serene acceptance. He was the end of their story, the final word in a grim sentence. And in fulfilling that role, he had become a living monument to medieval justice, a harsh, unyielding system that demanded not only the life of the condemned, but also the humanity of its instruments. Marius would sometimes walk to the edge of his property, gazing towards the distant village. He could see the faint smoke rising from its chimneys, hear the muted sounds of daily life carried on the wind. It was a world he had served, protected from its internal threats and external contaminations, yet a world that had, in turn, cast him out. He was the shadow that enabled their light, the filth that ensured their cleanliness, the monster that guaranteed their order. He was the price they paid for their concept of justice, and he paid it with his very soul. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and melancholic orange, Marius would return to the quiet warmth of his hearth. Thomas, having returned from his own grim duties, would be there, silently cleaning his tools, his profile stark against the fading light. Elara, her face etched with the years, would move between them, a silent guardian of their fractured peace. The cycle continued, unbroken, from father to son, generation after generation. The life of an executioner in the Middle Ages was not just bad, it was a profound, multifaceted tragedy. It was a sentence of perpetual isolation, a lifetime weighed, bound by a psychological burden that no amount of physical cleansing could wash away. It was a necessary evil, performed by an unloved hand, leaving an indelible stain not just on the condemned, but on the very soul of the man who wielded the tools of ultimate finality. And as the last light of day faded from the isolated cottage, the enduring shadow of their calling remained, a silent testament to the profound price of justice in a brutal age. And so, we conclude our somber journey into the life of Marius, the medieval executioner. It's a challenging story, filled with shadows, but one that offers a unique glimpse into the unseen corners of history and the novel, profound human cost of harsh societal roles. If this immersive tale resonated with you, if it offered you a quiet escape into the depths of history, please take a moment to show your support by hitting that like button. Your likes genuinely help our stories reach more listeners who appreciate this kind of immersive content. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. This way, you'll be among the first to know when our next historical journey begins. Before you drift off to sleep or move on with your day, I'm always eager to hear your thoughts. What historical period or figure would you like us to explore next? Perhaps another forgotten profession, a legendary journey, or a dramatic event? Share your ideas in the comments below. Your suggestions truly shape our next adventures. Thank you for joining me tonight on this deep dive into the past. Until our next journey, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with curiosity and wonder.